Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barnblog. And today we're continuing our secondary text discussion leading up to a discussion of the Lyon thesis response by Bordiga in 1925. But I want to make sure that I cover a lot of basis on the context of Bordigism, Bordiga, etc. Now, I also know that there are other controversies around this. I know the International Communist Tendency, for example, is going to talk about Dement and the controversies between Bordiga and Dement. And then we could talk about the International Communist Current's attempt to synthesize some of the Italian left with council communism from Jan Appel and that group. Those are inter-left communist debates that lead to a bunch of sectarian squabbling, some of which I think there's real points behind, but I'm not really a partisan for any of them. So I don't really see the point exactly. Today we're going to be discussing a series of articles mainly done for the Weekly Worker by the historian David Broder. David Broder is a Europe editor for Jacobin. He's a historian of Italy, actually focusing mostly on the Italian far right. He's the author of Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy, but also of First They Took Rome, How the Populist Right Conquered Italy, and then The Rebirth of Italian Communism, Dissent Communist in Rome, 1943 to 44. So I have used a lot of Broder's work on Italian communist in my discussion of Italian communists, not just the Italian left communist of either the Bordigist or the Dementist variety, but also on the history of Apparismo and Autonomia, and of the mainline Party of Italy, and the relationship between Italian communism, Italian left communism, and fascism, which is a complicated topic, as the capsule biography of Bordiga I did at the beginning of the series probably indicates. For those of you who don't know, I'm writing both an article for Strange Matters magazine on Bordiga and a chapter in my book that's also going to be on Bordiga, which would probably just be an extended version of the article I write for Strange Matters magazine on my ambivalence about Bordiga and why he became popular, what he speaks to contemporaneously. And we get into the Lyon theses and then maybe some of the other work like the Pannekoek-Bordiga debates, which is actually my first exposure to Bordiga in a serious sense, was either from Loren Goldner or from EndNotes Publishing, Giles Duvet talking about the Pannekoek-Bordiga debates. All right. And I might actually cover one of the Giles Duvet essays that I thought about at the time. Now, we also have noticed that in the context for ultra-leftism or whatever, Bordiga was called out by Lenin, but he really wasn't expelled or anathematized until much later. Anathematized is kind of the wrong word, but it's a functional equivalent here. And at one point was even seen as, he's condemned as a Trotskyist, which is kind of funny. Basically, pretty much everybody who was left of the Comintern was condemned as Trotskyist, even though the left oppositionists, which weren't all Trotskyists, Zioviev and Kamenev both end up being left oppositionists, as well as key figures in the original movement, including the guy who co-wrote the Bolshevik program with Bukharin, ended up as left oppositionists, whereas left communist is a more specific subset of things. So we'll get into that more later. But today we're going to go to a Weekly Worker article that David Broder wrote a long time ago, actually, over a decade ago. This is from 2013. So this is way before the interview that I just published with Petro Basso, which Broder did for Jacobin, but this is an earlier piece that he wrote for the Weekly Worker in the UK. And we're going to cover it today. I'm going to have my discussions about it. We're going to do a couple of Broder pieces before we get into the Internationalist Communist Party's introduction to the Lyon theses, which we are going to cover, and then we're going to cover the Lyon theses themselves. So this is going to be another one of these long series. I think what I'm going to do is I also have to get back and finish the On Authority series, and I want to still cover other articles. So we might have 3 different series going up a week. I've been kind of going back and forth between, a few of these and a few of the old series. I have noticed that if I put 2 of the same series up in the week, the first of the series gets a lot of views and the second does not. Although none of these series has a whole lot of views compared to like my solo shows or the interview shows. So make of that what you will. All right. My patrons, however, love these things, so I'm going to continue to make them. So anyway, let's go into this article. This is from the Weekly Worker from December 19th, 2013. And this is David Broder on Bordiga. And we'll just pull up the article for you here so you can read it along with me. All right. Bordiga and the Fate of Bordigism. Though he is largely remembered in the context of Lenin's polemic against left-wing communism, Amadeo, I'm not quite sure. Italian speakers, tell me how to say that name. I think I've been saying it wrong literally for 15 years. All right. Bordiga remains a towering figure of the 20th century workers' movement. David Broder explores his ideas in his political record. Few on the left are keen to associate themselves with the thought of Amadeo Bordiga. I mean, I was, but nonetheless. Founder of the Communist Party of Italy. While during his 1921 to 1923 period at the helm of the party, he was closely aligned with its other historical giants, most notably Antonio Gramsci, who headed the Communist Party of Italy from 1923 to 1927, and Palmiro Togliatti, who headed the party from 1938 to 1964. Ultimately, the party would viciously repudiate Bordiga, used as a political foil for the cult of a caricatured Gramsci. Not even many of the tiny fractious circles in the dissident traditions of Italian left communists would call themselves Bordigist. Yeah, a lot of them call themselves Dementist. Nonetheless, we can learn a lot from Bordiga. In terms of the way in which he clashed with the other prominent Marxists like Lenin and Gramsci, I do not mean that we ought to imitate Bordiga's position or that he preserves the forlorn stamp of relevance, nor just that it is healthy for the left to study the history of different currents of thinking, which it is, especially significant ones whose work is little read, like Bordiga's. It's more read now, but nonetheless. Rather than trying to understand these clashes from his perspective will allow us to better understand both the common assumptions of the post-World War I communist, who also include specific ways in which they're all irrelevant, and indeed help free those other figures from those who have embalmed their legacies. The most important questions I will address here include Bordiga's conception of the party and democracy, anti-fascism, and the role of the International. World War I. Amadeo Bordiga's first political activity was in the Italian Socialist Party, the PSI, which he joined in 1912. We've already discussed that. On the extreme left of the PSI, Bordiga's Karl Marx circle was part of a tendency whose most prominent exponent was Benito Mussolini. So, by the way, the maximalist position as held by Mussolini is kind of where a lot of slurs against Bordiga come from, because Mussolini was actually somewhat tied to the Bordigist position in the Karl Marx circle. Deploring the party's adaptation of bourgeois politics from its heavy focus on parliamentary activity to Freemasonry, patronage, and careerism that pervaded its upper ranks. 1912 was also the year that the Basingstoke Congress of the Second International voted to oppose the inter-imperialist war by all means, including an international general strike. In 1914, however, the international collapsed as its member parties ignored the decision and instead supported their own governments in World War I, inevitably invoking the national specificities or reactionary threat of their own states' opponents. Asterisk. The states who didn't do that are actually interesting. Like I said, the SPA, which was part of the Second International, didn't do that, despite all the yellow unionist, by that I mean chauvinist and jingoist socialist in the movement that would actually really kind of dominate the SPA in the 1950s during the McCarthy period. The exceptions were the Russian and sub-socialists, plus anti-war minorities in other countries. Asterisk, that's why I mentioned America. America was actually on the right side of that. Since Italy was initially not a participant, the PSI was divided into interventionists led by Mussolini, who in the never specified terms argued the war would bring about some sort of revolution. Asterisk, he seems to have started, Mussolini seems to have started as a what we would now call an accelerationist, that the war would accelerate the collapse of the Italian, rump empire. But later on, he actually defends it in terms of Italy as a proletarian state, and that the war was actually a good thing. So, Mussolini has a change of heart somewhere during the war, and the anti-war majority. Mussolini was expelled, and Bordiga was among his harshest critics. Yeah, Bordiga opposed Mussolini. People don't tar him with that. Indeed, after Italy joined the British, French, Russian side in 1915, the socialists took an ambiguous stance of neither supporting nor sabotaging the entire war effort, whereas Bordiga argued that we are not neutral. We are for the neutrality of our own state so as to facilitate the international class war against all states. Bordiga being principled, which was one thing you could accuse him of being for the most part, except for maybe during a silent period, which was a pretty long period, admittedly, from like 1930 to the end of the war. So like 1959, basically, 1949, basically, if my memory of my own capsule biography is correct. Anyway, this perspective, only narrowly defeated in 1917 PSI Congress, was somewhat similar to Lenin's revolutionary defeatism, turn imperialist war into civil war approach, though Bordiga did not believe the revolution in Italy would happen at the end of the conflict. Yeah, he was not a believer that revolutionary defeatism would work in Italy. All right, Russia and Il Soviet. The revolution led by Lenin did, of course, have profound impact on Marxists in Italy as in elsewhere. At the end of the war in 1918, Bordiga launched a new newspaper in Naples called Il Soviet. The group based around this publication was central to the creation of the communist fraction of the PSI. Bordiga wanted to split from the reformists and create a communist party, as we shall see. And it's very clear from reading Il Soviet that it was a partyist aspect of the Soviet experience rather than the Russia's workers, Sovieti, the councils themselves, that inspired the paper's thinking. So we already see the conflict between Bordiga and Pannekoek. And basically the distinction between Dutch-German left communists, who tend to be councilist, are Sovietists, and Italian left communists, who tend to be partyist. All right. Moreover, in post-war Italy, this was no abstract question, since in 1920, Biennio Rosso saw a wave of strikes and factory occupations in the industrial centers across the country. Antonio Gramsci's Turin L'Ordine Nouveau group saw the factory committees at the head of the struggle as the embryos of the Italian Soviets. Just so you know that Gramsci was associated with L'Ordine Nouveau. Quote, the factory council is the model of the proletarian state. All problems inherent to its organization of the proletarian state are inherent to the organization of the council. The existence of the council gives the workers direct responsibility for production, leads to them improve their work, establishes a conscious voluntary discipline, and creates a psychology of producers, creators of history. That's from Gramsci. Notice that, like Lukács and History and Class Consciousness, like a lot of the early, quote, Western Marxist, Gramsci was all down on the Soviets because that's what Lenin established as the prime. Yeah, But of course, he was also pro-party, unlike the councilists. All right. Il-Soviet begged to differ, in many ways reflecting the record of the leading Bolsheviks. Though after April 1917, Lenin won his comrades to the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," the party dropped this call in July and looked for a power base other than the Menshevik-dominated councils, only to return to it on the eve of the insurrection. As it happened, Soviet democracy was soon gutted out of the central planning agencies like Sovnarkom assumed control. Bordiga saw the Soviets in a similarly instrumental light. This is where the Bordiga is more Leninist than Lenin, more Stalinist than Stalin stuff comes from, by the way. Although that's an unfair characterization in the latter half. Soviets are not themselves organs of revolutionary struggle. They become revolutionary when the Communist Party was the majority within them. To maintain, after the fashion of Turin's L'Ordre de Nouveau comrades, that even before the collapse of the bourgeoisie, the workers' councils are organs not only of political struggle, but of techno-economic training in the communist system, can only be seen as a return to socialist gradualism. This latter, which whether it's called reformism or syndicalism, is defined by the mistaken belief that the proletariat can achieve emancipation by making advances in economic relations while capitalism still holds political power through the state. Now, I agree with part of that last bit. This is why I think workers' co-ops as a transitional model during current conditions is kind of delusional, because co-ops tend to act like slightly nicer capitalist firms. Yes, they're run better. Yes, the workers in them are less alienated. No, I don't oppose the creation of co-ops at all. But they still have to compete to stay profitable. All right. Indeed, if for Marx, the communists have no interest in separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole, for Bordiga, this meant that the working class interests lay exclusively within the party. Now, I don't know, asterisk, I do not know how he gets that from Marx. I know he thinks he does. He did not uphold the council communists or libertarian critiques of Leninism and the factory discipline of the Soviet Union, and saw no particular value in the workers' control of production, cooperatives, and the like. The party embodied the workers' historical mission and would one day take power. In short term, without this party, they would remain formless and undefined. The party actually is a nucleus without which there is no reason to consider the whole remaining mass of workers as a mobilization of forces. The class presupposes the party. I have no idea why. This is Varn talking. And because to exist and to act in history, it must possess a critical doctrine of history and aim to attainment. So the class must possess a critical doctrine of history, but that's got to be manifested in the party. And party has meant a bunch of different things, but he clearly means what the Bolsheviks mean by it. Communist Party. The view of the absolutely central of the party was part and parcel Bordiga's vehement rejection of democracy. While in some pieces Bordiga hedged his question by describing the dictatorship of the proletariat as proletarian democracy, counterposing this to bourgeois democracy, elsewhere he made it clear that he was opposed to democracy en bloc. Democracy embodied market principles, the exchange between individual units beholden to a power outside of them. In this sense, fascism and Stalinism were only a more extreme form of democracy rather than opposed to it, since they meant the active participation of the masses in a system of which they had no control. So we understand that Bordiga initially actually picks up the proletarian democracy and the dictatorship of the proletariat are the same thing, which is classical Marxism. Eventually, he seems to abandon that for organic centralism, which is a key point in the Lyon theses, which we'll get to. And it's what I have accused in the past in an article I wrote about a decade ago myself of being a lot more like Technocracy Inc. than anything I saw in Marx. But we'll get back to that, because I do think that's that criticism of organic centralism. I still stand by it. There are elements of Bordigism that I actually do think are still valid. All right. Within this perspective, the working class was formless and easily manipulated mass of individuals. which could only achieve consciousness of itself through a party which frontally clashed with democratic institutions. All right, now this strategy of classing with bourgeois democratic institutions, that's a classical, like early Second International Marx position, at least after the First International and before the Second. This included advocating abstention from electoral politics. Marx didn't do that. Marx actually advocated, however, basically what we might call today a Tea Party strategy, which is to obstruct as an electoral politics, but not really to have a positive politics unless one was able to take power. All right, so one was not supposed to participate and have, it is very clear in letters from Marx that one is not supposed to participate in a bourgeois government, but one can get elected to represent the workers and basically stop bourgeois bills from passing. That's what Marx thinks the party should do until it can take power. All right. Indeed, Bordiga's anti-parliamentarianism is well known thanks to the critique of it in Lenin's left-wing communism and infidel disorder, and he has entered history as an incorrigible ultra-left. However, there's a danger of anachronism here. First, both Lenin's references to Bordiga are counterbalanced by favorable comments. This was the period of the Communist International, founded in 1919, seeking to establish sections in each country by splitting the old socialist parties and breaking with the reformist opponents of the Russian Revolution. The PSI was characterized as a halfway house majority, led by Giacomo Cerati, who wished to join the Comintern, but without adopting the name communist or expelling the reformist, aka didn't take on the 21 points. That's foreign talking. Lenin commented, Comrade Bordiga and his faction of abstentionist communists are certainly wrong in advocating non-participation in parliament, but on one point, it seems to me Comrade Bordiga is right, ellipses, in attacking the reformist Taranti and his partisans who remain in the party, which has recognized Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat, yet continue their former pernicious and opportunist policy as members of parliament. Of course, in tolerating this, comrades Cerati and the entire Italian Socialist Party are making a mistake, which threatens to do as much harm as to give rise to the same dangers as it did in Hungary, where the Hungarian Taranti sabotaged both the party and the Soviet government from within. Such a mistaken, inconsistent, or spineless attitude towards opportunist parliamentarians give rise to left-wing communists, on the other hand, and to a certain extent justifies its existence on the other. So Lenin basically says, Bordiga is a rational response to certain kinds of opportunism, even though he thinks Bordiga's tactic is wrong. Okay. Secondly, the leader of the communist fraction in Italy, Bordiga, Gramsci, Togliatti, Longo, and others, I don't know much about Longo, thought the break with the reformists had taken too long. I mean, Togliatti and Gramsci were on the same page here. And indeed paralyzed them during the struggles of the Biennio Rosso. Bordiga made it clear that the differences among communists over electoral abstentionism would not divide them organizationally. So he thought the non-abstentionists should stay in the party. Right? It's only the reformists he wanted to kick out or split from. And it was on this basis that the Communist Party of Italy was founded on January 1921. Indeed, even when Bordiga was the undisputed leader of the Communist Party of Italy, he was not its dictator. He staunchly believed in abiding by the Comintern's discipline, which he viewed as obligatory for all national sections, unlike the example of the Second International in 1914, and as such implemented its decisions to participate in electoral campaigning. So Bordiga would do things he opposed because the party came to that conclusion in the Comintern, and he saw the Comintern as binding, even though it was quasi-democratic. So Bordiga believed in party discipline, united front. The Communist Party of Italy, however, was increasingly at loggerheads with the International. The Comintern had been formed at the start of 1919 in the hope of spreading revolution from its Russian center, and in its first 2 years, it followed the so-called theory of the offensive, advocated by its president, Georgy Zinoviev. Zinoviev, one of my least favorite Bolsheviks. I'm just not going to lie. I have a hard time liking Zinoviev because of all the stunts he pulled. Like Radek, I like. Kamenev, I like. I don't even hate all of early Stalin. But yeah. Yet by the time of 1921, the March action in Germany, an abortive and isolated uprising, and the near simultaneous Kronstadt rebellion in Russia, it became clear that the revolution risked collapsing altogether. This was the context for introducing the United Front. This was a policy that sought to bring about the unity of the working class-based parties, from communists to social democrats, including the so-called workers' government, a line which came to maturation in 1921-1922 during the Comintern's third and fourth congresses. Indeed, though in 1919 Bordiga had been very much in tune with the Comintern's mainstream, the Communist Party of Italy was born during the last gasp of the theory of the offensive. The result was that the Comintern tried to force the unwilling Communist Party of Italy leaders to merge with the socialists from whom they just broken. Yeah, that's not going to work. In contrast, Bordiga asserted his fidelity to the Comintern's existing positions. Indeed, he imputed his own views to Zinoviev, obeying the new Comintern's line in letter, if not in spirit. The Communist Party of Italy, like the Fischer-Maslow group in Germany's KPD, used the workers' government slogan only as a synonym for the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, thus ignoring the United Front policy underlying it. To be clear, Bordiga was not in principle opposed to all united fronts, since he was not against trade unionism, like today's Italian communist left, the Dissidents and their successors. Bordiga was a supporter of the United Front from below, which was also supported by William Z. Foster in the third period in America. It's also generally supported by like people like Hal Draper. It is not supported by Council Communist of the Pannekoek and John Appel tradition, and it is not generally supported by Dissidents and the majority of the Italian West Communist tradition. He advocated defensive common fronts on the economic question. In his view, these would not compromise the all-important independent political identity of the Communist Party, which had to stand in sharp contraposition to the world of democracy. He described the defensive platform of our party, the Proletariat Trade Union United Front, and the incessant political opposition to bourgeois power and all legal parties. So he's an anti-electoralist, but is okay with working with trade unions, which is, Dissidents do not. Neither the KA Payday and the Councilist. All right. This clearly entailed a rather mechanical division between political and economic activity. Yep, that's a problem. In fact, most trade unions in this period, and indeed the anti-fascist defense guards, were the works of militants of one or another party. And indeed, when push came to shove, Bordiga took a hostile view towards the initiatives of worker self-defense when they were not under the Communist Party of Italy's control. Anti-fascism. Now, this is where Bordiga stuff gets interesting, and I think the Basso interview didn't cover this well enough, so we need to get into this. This is why I'm covering these broader pieces. Bordiga opposed the democratic centralism characteristic of the early communist parties in name of his own organic centralism. Now, that's going to come up in the Lyon theses, and we're going to talk more about it, but we have to remember that democratic centralism was actually something from the Lassallean side of the merger of the Lassallean All-German Workers Union with the Eisenacher group, and this is somewhat confusing because Kautsky and Lenin really kind of have a more nuanced version of democratic centralism, but ultimately what the Soviet Union ends up practicing does look a lot more like what Lassalle encouraged than anything that you can get out of Marx, although Marx was a centralist. He was a centralizer and thought that popular votes were binding. So in that sense, he was a soft democratic centralist, but not to the extent that the Lassalleans were, and the Lassalleans are where that idea comes from. Kautsky didn't make it up. All right. And it's never mentioned explicitly, and Lenin, and Engels are. It is explicitly mentioned in Lenin. It is not explicitly mentioned in Engels or Marx, although there are some things that imply it. All right. This placed priority of the party of well-trained cadres loyal to a fixed program against the mass members, or indeed the tryst in terms of democratic decision-making. This is this idea of organic centralism is why I kind of because part of it's based on an adherence to the invariant program, and part of it's based on expertise. All right, we'll get back to that later. As Giacomo's work strongly emphasizes, this fitted with Bordiga's strong focus on preserving the already established correct theory rather than accepting innovation or adopting theory to contingent situations, aka the program is internal and does not change. This is, for some of the stuff early Bordiga shares with Lukács, on this there's a radical difference. All right. Nonetheless, while this was in the later years a model for many left communist sects, it was a pious risk rather than the real culture of the Bordiga era Communist Party of Italy, which was in fact a turbulent mass of branches inherited from the PSI and other anarchist circles and strongly characterized by local traditions and loyalty. This lack of top-down control was fortunate in many ways, not the least, as the leadership, and indeed that of the PSI, were opposed to their members' participation in most of the important working-class anti-fascist movement, the Arditi El Populo, the ADAP. I'm saying that like it's German. This was an armed movement uniting anarchists, communists, and socialists, which fought a heroic pitched battles to defend the working-class areas and meeting spaces from fascists with no official party apparatus to help. Bordiga is often, for this reason, characterized as passive in the face of fascism, insisting that it was nothing new. Indeed, he did, along with the other Communist Party of Italy leaders, thought it was likely that the Italian bourgeoisie would attempt a social democratic solution to the crisis of the post-war liberal state, perhaps but not necessarily including the fascist. Indeed, none of the Comintern leaders grasped the mass character or strength and depth of fascism before Mussolini was in office, tending to portray it as a reactionary capitalist combination similar to the Russian Whites or the Black Hundreds. Bordiga favored self-defense against the fascists, but exclusively under the Communist Party's own control. Gramsci was less hostile towards the ADP, but his criticisms of the party's stance were hesitating and voiced in only general terms. Rejecting any such self-restraint, many Communist Party of Italy branches took their own initiative, and indeed most of the ADP militias, in any case, included communist militants. And while this was not enough to stop fascism, and it was far from clear that the working class defeated in 1919-1920 could have done, undoubtedly these militants should have been listened to by the party leadership and their effort championed rather than simply tolerated. And indeed, I find this interesting about Bordiga is what he does and does not allow, in contradiction to his rhetoric, both in 1925 and later in the 1950s. And we'll come back to that. Indeed, in December 1922, the Fourth Congress of the Comintern, held just weeks after the fascist so-called March on Rome, and Mussolini's appointment as prime minister, saw harsh reproaches from the Italians' failure to engage with the ADP. This was also the beginning, if only a beginning, of Gramsci diverging from Bordiga. While both regretted Comintern pressure to remerge with the reformist, Gramsci sought to shift the discussion onto the terrain of what conditions would hypothetically make this acceptable, rather than merely asserting their flat refusal. This approach was intended to prevent the Comintern sharply imposing a new leadership from above, which happened anyway eventually, one well to the right of the existing one, and thus to preserve its commitment to an imminent proletarian revolution. Gramsci's trying to navigate. Now, I used to be too harsh on Gramsci for this time period and some of Gramsci's early stances. It's pretty clear here that he's actually trying to be a communist center negotiating between the Comintern and the Social Democrats to try to buy the Communist Party of Italy time. Doesn't really work, but you can get where he's coming from. Upon returning from Moscow, Bordiga was arrested by the new fascist regime and never to reclaim his leadership. In the first year of the government, Mussolini sought to portray himself as a safe pair of hands, someone who would keep a check on both the working class and his own black shirt hoodlums. The king and the liberal establishment had raised him to the power, hoping that he would tame his own movement, which only had 35 MPs and was constrained by a Blard coalition. The opposition parties were still legal, though subject to black shirts attacks, which severely constrained the workers' movement. This all changed after the 1924 April elections. Amidst heavy intimidation and ballot rigging, a fascist-backed national bloc won 2/3 of the seats. Giacomo Matteotti, the leader of the reformist socialists, spoke out against the fraud and was murdered by black shirts. This was disastrous for Mussolini, not only sparking revulsion amongst the working class, but also encouraging elite fears that the fascist leader could not control his own plebeian base. The government was in crisis. The main dallies took a much more critical stance towards Mussolini, and the black shirts were called off the streets, and the opposition parties abandoned in parliament in protest the so-called Aventine secession. We talked about this in the capsule biography and in a few of the other pieces we read. It came up in the IMT piece on Bordiga too. The Communist Party of Italy, now headed by Antonio Gramsci, joined the opposition bloc, believing that even if it was the king who sacked Mussolini, this would spark a general crisis in which anything would become possible, including proletarian revolution. This was in effect, though not codified as such, an early version of the Popular Front idea of splitting the ruling class in order for the latter to defeat a much diminished enemy. Yeah. Gramsci's adoption of a semi-popular front ends up being a bad idea. That's Varn's take. In reality, this policy saw the Communist Party of Italy hemmed in by its bourgeois allies. Yep, that's always the mistake. Who ejected both the communist general strike call and the terribly unconstitutional suggestion that it declare itself the legitimate parliament. While the Aventine secession did nothing, waiting for the king's intervention, Mussolini's radical lieutenants pressured him to take decisive action, and he did, imposing new restrictions on the press. The Duce of Fascism declared his responsibility for the black shirts' actions. The opposition MPs' mandates were canceled and their parties banned. Bordiga was strongly critical of the Communist Party of Italy's role in this episode. This is a long Bordiga quote. They should have remained in parliament, launched a political attack on the government, and immediately taken up a position opposed to the moral and constitutional prejudices of the Aventine, which would determine the outcome of the crisis in fascism's favor. The preparation of the masses, which leant towards supporting the Aventine rather than wishing for its collapse, was in any case made worse by the party proposed to the opposition party that they set up their own anti-parliament. This tactic in any case conflicted with the decisions of the International, which never envisioned proposals being made by parties which were clearly bourgeois. Worse still, it lay totally outside the domains of communist principles and tactics and outside the Marxist conception of history. The International. The Communist Party of Italy of 1921 to 1926 never definitively broke with the idea of a big bang proletarian and socialist revolution. However, after its crushing by fascism, the exiled party's life, and that of the post-war party, was characterized more than anything else by the search for a system of alliances with other social layers, tailoring the Italian national conditions. This was the theme of Gramsci's 1930 prison notebooks, though in the history of the Tagliati of post-World War II Italian Communist Party in the Gramsci studies industry, the degree to which he was a Democrat who broke with the idea of the working class revolution is vastly exaggerated, albeit facilitated by the fragmentary character of these texts written in jail. Yeah, by the way, all the prison notebooks are still not translated in English. Pete Buttigieg's dad never finished it. Back to the piece. In the 1926 Congress had held to be in Lyon, France, on the account of fascist repression. Here, Gramsci and Tagliati's majority theses did make some steps towards engaging with specific social conditions of Italy, its small and geographically concentrated working class, the underdevelopment of the South, and so on, while also advancing the idea of a Republican assembly of the workers and peasants. Bordiga's alternative theses opposed any political united front, but were heavily defeated, not without the help of a degree of ballot rigging, and with branches unable to attend the exiled Congress counted as voting for the existing leadership. And I talked about that in the IMT episode as well. Well, actually, the author did, but yeah. While himself from the South, Bordiga was strongly averse to any focus on regional and national particularities, which were just part of a narrow corporatism that he counterposed to the working class universal historic mission. Indeed, Bordiga opposed the idea that the national communist parties made up the International, instead seeing them as a section of a single world party which structured them from above. Yeah, I had misread Bordiga's stance against Stalin, which he saw as the Russians dominating the world movement, which he did actually. That's consistent as an advocacy that the various national sections should be kind of equally balanced. He doesn't seem to think that one national front should dominate the entire Comintern, but basically that the Comintern should work as the brain of the entire party, trying to focus revolution elsewhere, not just defend Russia's gains. All right. For this reason, amid the rise of Stalinism, Bordiga did not side with the Russian oppositions as much as counterpose the possible sectional interests of the Soviet state to the Comintern's revolutionary policy. In his intervention at the 1926 enlarged executive of the Comintern, Bordiga argued that the International ought to be able to exert control over the Soviet Union, since it was just a part of a world movement, and its state policy, viewed from a purely Russian foreign policy perspective, threatened to overwhelm this movement. Quote, the problem of Russian policy cannot be resolved within the narrow limits of the Russian movement alone. The direct collaboration of the whole of the Communist International is absolutely essential. Without such collaboration, not only revolutionary strategy in Russia, but also our policies in the capitalist states will be seriously threatened. A tendency may emerge to water down the character and role of the communist parties. I mean, by the 1940s and 50s, that's definitely true. Or you have a really, really opportunist, you have more anti-revisionist in the second anti-revisionist controversy, which is just basically the controversy about how much you like Stalin. Even though Stalin set up a lot of conditions that led to the Sino-Soviet split, nonetheless, you have this beginning that splits the entire socialist movement this way. Moreover, Bordiga protested against the Bolshevization advanced by Zinoviev. Which supposedly made the parties of the International more like the Russian one, but that of the 1926, not of the 1917. This is always an issue. Like the Trotskyists like the 1921 Bolsheviks. I like the 1917 Bolsheviks enough. But Zinoviev was the 1926 Bolsheviks. The parties would follow Moscow's discipline and achieve organizational hardness through the intolerance towards dissent. Yeah, Bordiga was not anti-dissent, which is interesting given his anti-democratic status. Something to think about. All right. Indeed, despite Bolshevization's pretenses as cadre development, Bordiga saw it as going hand in hand with the conquest of the masses slogan advanced at the Third Congress and the United Front. It promised to secure unity through disciplinary means rather than political consistency. And differences of opinion do exist. This will to prove that the party is marred by errors, that the party does not have the capacity to radically combat the degenerative tendencies of the working class movement, which normally manifest themselves at certain critical moments in the general situation. If one is faced by the case of indiscipline, this is a symptom showing that this fault still exists in the party. Discipline, in fact, is a result, not of a point of departure. Yet, in recent times, a regime of terror has been established in our parties, a kind of sport which consists of intervening, punishing, annihilating, and with all of this, a certain special pleasure, as if it was precisely the idea of the party life. Yeah, Bordiga is actually saying that the Russian Bolsheviks are too repressive at 1926. And again, this is from a guy who thought democracy was utterly a sham. His criticism also reflected his critique of democracy. Rather than a party sticking to its program, remember, invariant program, its leaders would use a formless and uneducated masses of new members to retreat from its communist position and settle scores with factional opponents. Opportunism. Despite the strong, unappealing whiff of organic centralism, there is an insight here. Yeah, so Broder, like me, also thinks organic centralism is a bad idea. All right, after all, in the Lenin-Levy, Stalin flooded the party with new members to drown oppositionists. Togliatti achieved something very similar by creating his own new party during World War II resistance. The same ploy was also, of course, at work in the recent SWP conference preparations, though parodied. The long inactive members who haven't paid their subs for years were deployed by the CC faction to outvote the younger members trying to reclaim their organization. That's about a Central Committee debate when the SWP had a crisis in the beginning of the 2010s. The ISO had a crisis a little later, but it killed the ISO. The SWP in the years from like 2011 to 2013, the British SWP went from being like a big deal to the worldwide English-speaking left to kind of a joke. Anyway, World War II. This was Bordiga's last great attack on the generation of communist parties, and he was sent into confino, forced internal exile, upon his return to Italy. Expelled from the Communist Party of Italy in 1930 for his refusal to condemn Trotsky, Yeah, that I should also read that. That's actually an interesting piece. Bordiga dropped out of political activity and became a hate figure for his former party. Despite the friendly relations between Bordiga and Gramsci, just degradation of Bordiga became part of the cult around which the Sardinian martyr, whose death and imprisonment was counterposed to Bordiga's inaction. Yep. A characteristic of Stalin-era Communist Party was to draw a direct link between Bordiga, Trotsky, and fascism. Bordiga was a Trotskyist in so much that he broke party unity and thus served fascism. And a lot of stuff seems to have been generated to support this later on. I don't know, like there's a lot of accusations that like the pictures and stuff around Bordiga were fake. There's other people who said it was, opportunist. It's hard to say. Bordiga was so quiet during this time period, it's hard to know. Therefore, he must be a paid agent of the latter. This was pretty common. It's pretty common in general for everyone to accuse everybody who they disagree with being a paid agent of fascism. The analysis was also used to attack all left opponents from the 1930s to the 1950s, no matter what their connection was to Trotskyism, still less fascism. During World War, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, during World War II, this became particularly acute as the party reemerged from its clandestine existence with the rise of the resistance. Pierre Brunet, I think, had noted that while exiled leaders developed popular fronts, cross-class conceptions, this approach was totally unknown to the vast majority of party members in Italy, and therefore, when they began to reorganize during 1943 to 1945, they were totally bemused. The history of the Italian Communist Party from 1943 onwards is a history of a Stalinist apparatus being brought into Italy from outside, struggling to impose itself from above upon the real party, the true party, the party that had totally survived fascism, and continue to live on in the workers' districts and the villages, and to muzzle them and to oppose on their Bordigist traditions a Stalinist war policy for which was obviously no tradition had prepared them, aka the Popular Front. Even though we can see that there was something like a Popular Front proposed by Gramsci, this was not the Popular Front of the post-third period Stalin. All right. By comparison, the first communists were prepared to take cross-class approach to their anti-fascist resistance, having long been schooled and mounting abrupt strategic turns to suit Stalinist foreign policy, as well as expressing their ideas in patriotic terms during the 1934 to 1939 Popular Front. Yeah, the whole like revolutionary patriotism, Broderism, all this stuff, this came up a lot when the Comintern abandoned third periodism. It just completely reversed its opposite. Anyway, this was anathema to the veterans of the 1921 to 1926 Communist Party of Italy, which had never abandoned a specifically working class and revolutionary perspective. For this reason, thousand-strong dissidents for communist formation arose in numerous cities, questioning Togliatti's Popular Front line or even accusing him of betraying Stalin. Togliatti saw the ghost of Bordiga behind these ultra-left positions, and the PCI press carried venomous attacks upon them. Now, notice that we have the Communist Party of Italy now. There's two Communist Parties of Italy. All right, it's just something to note. Prometheo and Stella Rosa and other papers of this kind write, today we must not fight the Germans to fight democracy, but for the dictatorship of the proletariat and Bolshevism. Slavish pasties of Hitler. In all countries, including Italy, there is an alliance of the parties to chase out the Germans. The attempts of Hitler, Goebbels, and the other Italian left communist servants to divide the bloc are ridiculous. Leaders of both groups were murdered by PCI partisans. Yeah, this began the inter-communist murders, which is, something the 30s and 40s are known for. Not a great time period. In truth, Bordiga was not himself involved and did not even attempt to mount these eclectic and multi-tendency groups into a new revolutionary organization. For Bordiga, the working class was too caught up in democratic ideology in both the Axis and Allied camps for revolution to be possible. Yeah, this is where his remnant invariance comes from. This is where I'm talking again. Exile circles had kept something like Bordiga's ideas alive in the Italian Communist left in 1943, forming the International Communist Party, the PCI, the PC International. Even though their analysis denouncing the imperialist character of the war and seeing all anti-fascist struggle as wholly subordinate to this, had little perspective for how the working class could emerge as a separate revolutionary camp. Without a revolutionary period, Bordiga saw no value in a revolutionary party. Joining the PCI International in 1949, he attacked the voluntarism of its leadership, which sought to build itself as a new party, including standing election candidates to make an anti-parliamentary propaganda. actually, which to be fair to the Communist Party International's old leadership, that actually kind of is the stance of Marx and Engels. Anyway, in 1952, he split, forming the Programma Comunista, which is where the current PC International comes from. There's a lot of splits in Bordigism, just like Trotskyism in that sense. In a certain entirely schematically defined period of retreat, which was important to work on preserving Marxist theory. Indeed, in the 1950s, Bordiga developed a more substantial critiques of the nature of the Soviet economy, which he defined as state capitalism. Bordiga's state capitalism is different than Panacoc's state capitalism, or Rudolf state capitalism, or the anarchist, like everybody's state capitalism is different. All right, seeing the isolation of the Soviet state as fundamental to this degeneration, Border argued that the revolutionary transition was dependent on both a high level of prior economic development. See my discussion on the Kriegerberg of the Goethe program on Daniel De Leon's insistence that the bourgeois revolution, while a good, needs to happen separate from a communist one, which was what he critiqued the Second International for doing, like in the 1910s. I mean, like before even 1914 happened. All right. Bordiga argued that the revolutionary transition was dependent on both a high level of prior economic development and taking immediate measures to phase out money. Yeah, Bordiga sees the areas of bourgeois culture that's left as actually rationing via labor tokens, which is similar to the Council of Communists in this regard. So, and he thinks that rationing is temporary, although how temporary is unclear. And he plays with labor tokens, and he plays with like total rationing. Bordiga works out a lot of different attempts to work this out. But that's the difference in people who read that maintains a bourgeois culture as maintaining a market under different conditions, which is maintained by Donis and Khrushchevites and all kinds of most social democrats. My friend Ben Burgess, like I can go on. I actually tend to think Bordiga's understanding of that element of the critique of the Goethe program is right. All right. Again, the international character of the revolution was more centrally posed than the question of bureaucracy or are the democratic forms. Even the Chinese Revolution could be saved by revolution in the West. So Bordiga thought if you had the world revolution, all the other revolutions would actually work themselves out. You wouldn't need to overthrow this stuff. All right, Bordiga. Comintern. Bordiga always knew that the Italian communists could not simply follow the Russian example. Perry Anderson notes that it was not Gramsci, but his comrade and antagonist Amadeo Bordiga who was to formulate the true nature of distinction between the East and the West, though he never theorized it in any cogent practice. In fact, Bordiga did draw conclusions from practice, but ones opposite to Gramsci's, whereas Bordiga saw the power of democratic ideology in pacifying and dividing the working class and sought to oppose it en bloc, creating a Communist Party whose strength was its independence from such processes, i.e. abstaining from elections. The Sardinian thinker increasingly saw the need for the working class and the party to participate in and overcome these institutions, hence the focus on hegemony. Sadly, the engagement of these two friends and comrades was cut short by fascist repression. In their absence, the Communist Party was, during the Stalin period, increasingly at the whim of Moscow, and the only freedom it had was to express its policy in national terms. This was essential to the development and self-identity of the PCI, as opposed to the PCDI, from its role in the resistance to German occupation to its ultimate break from Moscow in the 1970s, Eurocommunism, and then into Operizo and other stuff. Even in its post-1992 incarnation as a social democratic party, alas, Gramsci's thought has been misrepresented and thus recruited to this tradition. Yet from his engagement with Bordiga and some of the fundamental assumptions they shared, it is quite apparent how alien his revolutionary thought was to the Italian Blairites who invoke his name today. For Bordiga's part, little is left of his legacy. Even in Italy, the communist left is macroscopic. The milieu is not composed of Bordigists in the fashion of Trotskyists, being rooted in exile group formed after 1948 by such figures as Arnato Dement and Orianino Parone, rather than under the leadership of the enacted Bordiga. And moreover, because Bordiga's post-war positions clash with the others. For this same reason, we cannot contrapose Bordigism to Bordiga himself in the manner that we might question the merits of post-Marxism, post-Lenin-Leninism, or post-Trotskyism. Yeah, I mean, the Bordiga in the Italian left communist tradition is basically can be Dementist or Bordigist, and that's pretty much it. And that's because the Italian left communist majority actually did not go with Bordiga's program in Comunista. All right, as far as I know. Bordiga thought of the limited relevance today because even he framed it in terms of specificity to its own time. Yes, he did, although the invariance is not supposed to be specific. His own political trajectory was strongly marked by his essentially one-dimensional view of the objective conditions that existed, apparently determined in large measure by his personal biographical situation. Seeing the post-World War I period as the death of social democracy and the opportunity for the working class revolution, Bordiga from 1919 to 1921 stood very much in line with the basic assumptions of the Comintern as regards to the revolutionary nature of the period. I mean, ironically, Bordiga gets kicked out in a time period where, during third periodism, where like some of his positions are actually the positions of Stalin, but for different reasons and with a different logic and rationale. All right. The need for a sharp breaking, defining the communists in opposition to reformists and the leading role of the party. However, in the years the Communist Party of Italy resisted the Comintern's retreat from such positions, after his own expulsion, Bordiga with himself reached an even more gloomy conclusion: the impossibility of building a party in the supposed period of retreat of World War II. This was just one of the ways in which Bordiga was prone to schematic thinking with an ultimatist and undynamic conclusions. Yet, if we are to draw negative conclusions from Bordiga's experience, it is one we must study in order to understand the limitations of the early Communist International. And while I do not consider myself still a Bordigist, I kind of agree with this sentiment that Bordiga is super important to understand fairly and honestly, and to not just caricature. Right? I feel that way about Dement and Panikkuk and a lot of these left communists, Goldner, etc., as well as a lot of the mainstream communists, such as Stalin himself, the various Stalinists, Bukharin, etc. I even sometimes like to study the Lovestonites. What are you going to do? All right. We'll do more of these Broder things for context, and we're going to go into context on Gramsci. Then we'll finally get to the current Communist Internationalist Communist Party's introduction to the Lyon theses and get into them. But I think we are also going to just be cycling this out with some other pieces. So we're also going to go back and finish the Judge Szabo's On Authority. And I'm going to do some readings of some other texts, anarchist and otherwise. People keep throwing anarchist texts at me, so I'm also going to do some scholarly Marxist texts as well. One of the advantages of the anarchist texts is they tend not to be copyrighted, so I don't have to worry about covering them in detail with a problem. I don't cover anything that's behind a paywall because I don't want to get sued on radical engagements. And I'm doing commentary on these works, so unless they say we can't do commentary on them, it's fair use. And also, I hope to popularize them. Like, you guys should go read the stuff I'm reading closely to see if you agree with my interpretation in historical gloss. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. You can get additional material for the little $3 a month. Have a great day. Thank you.